This beautiful tank is called Leopard 1 and is a German tank produced in West Germany in mid-60s and was actually a collaboration project between Germany, France and Italy to try to produce a tank that would become the standard tank for all of the European forces and would obviously be used in defense of Europe in case of the Soviet Union attack. Now today we're going to talk about this tank and also about the only major battle that it has actually seen in history and talk a little bit more about the historical importance of this tank both in Europe and also around the world. Welcome to What the Math. Interestingly, this tank was developed during the era where all of the tanks used heat ammunition. Heat ammunition refers to high explosive anti-tank warhead that was essentially used to penetrate any kind of armor and use something called Monroe effect to try to create a very high velocity particles that would actually enter any kind of armor and then destroy everything inside the tank. Now, because of this, the German forces decided that they needed to create a tank that was mainly mobile and really fast and also had high firepower, but the armor wasn't really as essential anymore. And so when they were creating this design, they decided to focus on the fact that they just wanted a tank that could not be penetrated by any kind of small arms, specifically 20mm ammunition that was used on smaller tanks. And they made sure that this tank was basically impenetrable to smaller ammunition, but in terms of the actual anti-tank armor, this didn't really have any kind of a heavy armor that you would expect on the Soviet tanks of that era or even the American tanks, because having analyzed previous battles, they decided that mobility and firepower was a lot more important for a main battle tank than its armor. They also wanted to make sure that this tank was protected from any kind of chemical weapons and also radioactive fallout, and obviously was a kind of a well-rounded tank that could basically survive any sort of attack and could also relocate itself relatively quickly using high mobility. And despite having less armor than other tanks of this era, it was actually a very successful design and began to be purchased by other NATO countries like, for example, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and even Canada, my home country, purchased quite a lot of these tanks, and they became the main battle tanks of Canadian forces as well. But interestingly, because of the German policy of not selling these tanks to dictatorships, Greece, Spain and Chile were not actually able to purchase these tanks and had to settle for the French alternative called AMX-30, which were not as popular as the Leopard tanks. And although many different countries adapted this tank as their main battle tank instead of using the American alternatives, interestingly, it was the Canadian forces that really went all out. They actually converted many of these tanks to multi-purpose vehicles. They used them for anything from vehicle recovery to even bridge laying. So some of these vehicles were used in laying bridges to cross the rivers. And even to this day, the derivative of this tank is still used in Canada as a kind of a main battle tank and was even sent to Afghanistan very recently, where it saw a battle against the Taliban forces. But today we're actually going to talk about a little bit of a different battle where this tank participated, and this was actually officially the first engagement this tank has ever seen, because fortunately for the German forces and for this tank, it's never really got to face off against the actual Soviet forces. But it did get to face off against T-55 tanks and other Soviet tanks during the Bosnian War, a conflict that took place in former Yugoslavia that has very different names in different countries, but in English it's usually known as the Bosnian War, where it was a conflict between the Serbian forces, the Croatian forces, and also the forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The conflict that was essentially very one-sided at some point, and eventually led to some serious war crimes, including genocide. This conflict also served as a kind of a test ground for the UN forces, specifically the peacekeepers, and during this conflict, a lot of the UN peacekeepers were basically sent to different locations to try to protect the civilians. And unfortunately for the UN, in many cases they actually failed because of the strict regulations and orders. They were not allowed to engage the enemy forces, and during several sieges by the Serbian forces, the UN forces were actually forced to retreat, and this led to many different war crimes, including various cases of ethnic cleansing and mass murder of civilians, and of course rape. But before we actually talk about the battle where this tank played a role and actually did help save civilian lives, let's talk about how this whole conflict started. So the so-called Yugoslav wars were basically ethnic conflicts. They weren't really related to communism or anything else. They were based on the fact that former Yugoslavia was essentially a mix of different races living all together in a very kind of a interesting coalition. And all of this was because the nation that was previously known as Yugoslavia was created after the World War I, and actually was composed of both Slavic Christians but also Muslim minority that came there during the Ottoman Empire conquests, and of course also had Catholics as well from Croatia. And after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, many of these nations wanted to have autonomy. They wanted to have their own countries with their own sort of rules and regulations. And because of the economic hardships following the fall of Soviet Union, Yugoslavia started to face quite a lot of nationalist uprising. There were various ethnic groups that basically became very violent toward each other. And so by the early 90s, there was essentially no way to control any of this. And Serbia, which was the predominant power in that region, wanted to have more central control, while other regions like Bosnia and Herzegovina or Croatia wanted to have more autonomy, and there was just too much friction between them, and this essentially led to an all-out war. And so one by one, each of these little republics that you see on the map here separated and became their own countries. So first there was Slovenia, then there was Croatia. But unfortunately, each time one of these republics separated, there was a conflict, there was war, and the Yugoslavian forces tried to stop them. And following the war in Slovenia and Croatia, Bosnia was next. And here there was predominantly a territorial conflict between the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this republic was supported by Bosniaks, which were actually predominantly Muslim, and a self-proclaimed Bosnian entity called Serbian Republic, which was supported by Croatia and Serbia. So essentially this turned into a somewhat ethnic/religious conflict where the Christians and Catholics were essentially fighting the Muslims, and even though it technically had nothing to do with religion, it essentially was their justification for committing some of the major atrocities during the war. Now, this war also saw one of the major sieges of a city in the modern warfare, and this refers to the siege of Sarajevo, which actually was the longest siege of a capital city in the modern warfare history. And this was the siege by the Serbian Republic and lasted for something like 1400 days, or essentially almost 4 years. So this was probably the longest siege in the modern warfare. It was even longer than siege of Stalingrad or siege of Leningrad during the Second World War, and resulted in quite a lot of casualties, specifically civilian casualties. And seeing all of this madness, UN decided to propose a mandate called UN Security Council Resolution 743, which basically in 1992 created a UN force that was supposed to protect the civilians and try to make sure that there's at least some control in certain regions of former Yugoslavia. And the idea here was to create 3 demilitarized safe havens where you could basically have civilians in peace, and at the same time you could actually have a place for negotiations and possible peace resolutions. And at first, these resolutions actually did create safe zones, but with time, the Serbian forces started to attack them as well, leading the UN forces to basically counterattack and strike back at the Serbian forces using both the Air Force and the really well-trained UN forces, specifically from countries like Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and of course Canada. And the two operations where the Leopard tanks were used were Operation Bøllebank and Operation Amanda. Both of these were used in 1994, which is basically 30 years after the initial deployment of the Leopard 1 tank. And both of these operations were essentially either counterattacks or retaliation or defense attacks against the Serbian forces that tried to strike at the UN forces that were positioned in certain regions of Bosnia-Herzegovina. In first such attack, which was called Operation Bøllebank, the Danish forces, which actually haven't seen any battling since Second World War, were on a peacekeeping duty in Bosnia, and their forces got attacked by the Republic of Serbia forces, and which had 3 T-55 tanks and lots of anti-tank missiles. And here, despite being ambushed, the 7 Leopard tanks from Danish forces were not only able to survive this ambush, but also destroy the T-55 tanks, and were essentially able to rout the Serbian forces and defend their position in this area. And even though this was the first engagement for the Leopard 1 tank and for the Danish forces since the Second World War, they actually did relatively well, with only one of the vehicles being slightly damaged, but essentially destroying the Serbian artillery and possibly even their tanks, which were at least scared off and didn't really fire back at all. And the second time that this tank saw action was during an actual attack by the Danish forces, where they actually got fed up with constant sniper attacks on their positions, and they decided to strike back at the Serbian Republic forces, which had at least one T-55 tank that was then disabled and essentially destroyed. And they only used 3 of their Leopard tanks to go on the offensive and try to eliminate the sniper position that was constantly harassing Danish forces. And interestingly, even though they once again had a chance of calling in airstrikes, they decided to just do a tank versus tank battle, and even try to explain their reasoning by saying something along the lines of, the best tank killing weapon is another tank. So we didn't really need air support for this mission. And this was actually very admirable of them, because not only air support would most likely cause more civilian casualties, but using the really advanced heat cameras on their tank, they were able to essentially pinpoint the exact location of the Serbian forces and only attack the forces and not the civilians. And their cameras were so exact that they could even see the heat signature on the T-55 tank just to see if it actually fired back at them. And having actually seen that the tank was, warm and not cold, they basically decided to destroy it. And essentially what you see me recreate using Wargame Red Thunder here is this type of an engagement. So we have very few Leopard tanks engaging a relatively massive T-55 force, and we're using no air force, nothing else, just the tanks themselves, trying to essentially liberate the city that was occupied by the T-55 forces and various infantry forces with anti-tank rockets. And because of these small operations, and of course because of the airstrikes, at some point the Serbian forces were forced to sign the peace treaty, which finally led to the end of this war. But this of course was not the end of the war in Yugoslavia, and other wars were still to follow. And officially this war ended with the signing of something called Dayton Agreement in December of 1995. And the agreement essentially stated that there would be a formation of the autonomous Republic of Serbia within Bosnia-Herzegovina. But despite the peace treaty being signed, unfortunately the war in this region was far from over, and the next war, specifically the Kosovo War, would start only 2.5 years later, and of course the Leopard tanks would see action again. But nevertheless, we can't really ignore the effects of the NATO airstrikes and of course the bravery of the Danish forces using the Leopard tanks against the Serbian T-55s, because if it wasn't for them, the negotiations would take much longer, and who knows, there could have been more war crimes, more potential genocides, and more civilians killed. And so the pressure from the Danish forces and from NATO airstrikes led the Serbians to sign the peace treaty a lot faster. And essentially this is how Leopard 1 influenced the history of the world and how it led to a peace treaty being signed a lot faster. Anyway, so this is it for this video and for Leopard 1 tank. Hopefully you enjoyed the historical information you've learned in this video and learned a little bit more about how this tank influenced the world. Check out some of the other tank videos and history videos I made, and also check out some of the other videos about space and space history as well. And if you've enjoyed this video, share it with your friends, like it, and of course don't forget to subscribe. And in the next video we're going to take a look at another tank from Armored Warfare, and we'll probably investigate another historical mission where that particular tank influenced the world. Thank you so much for watching, I'll game you guys later, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and see you next year in the next video. Game you later, and bye bye.